Hello, everybody. This is Gregory Gause from the University of Vermont, where I teach political science, and welcome to Blogging Heads TV. This is the third edition of the Shadi and Greg show, and so I'll let my partner, Shadi Hamid, introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Shadi Hamid. I'm the Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center and a Fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. I focus on democratization in the Arab world and the role of Islamist movements. And so we'll be talking certainly about some of those issues today. Greg, do you want to get us started up?
Sure. Shadi, I know that we're behind the news curve a little bit here, but we might as well start with the president's speech of last week, a major speech on the Middle East, being compared to his early speech in Cairo. And it really set out, I think, in a very forthright way, that the United States was going to be 100% behind the movements toward regime change and greater democracy in the Arab world, with maybe one or two exceptions that were more less mentioned, but because they weren't mentioned, one figures that they're exceptions. My take on the speech was that it was very much within the consensus in American politics that is formed post 9/11 about what we as a country should do in the Middle East. I think that consensus, which spans the political spectrum, it's not just neoconservatives. I think it includes a lot of liberal interventionists, a lot of people in the Democratic Party, as well as most Republicans these days. I think that consensus is that the root causes of the threats that are emerging in the Middle East to us, terrorism, other kinds of threats, are misgovernment and authoritarianism in the Middle East, and thus the job of American foreign policy is to change the domestic politics of Middle Eastern countries. I dissent from that consensus, both analytically. I don't think it's the cause of the problems we have in the Middle East, and also because I think the prognosis, which is greater American involvement in the domestic politics of the Middle East, is beyond our means. We don't do it well, right, and I don't think we have the resources. President Obama is not President Bush. He's not going to send armies into the Middle East to change regimes. But the speech, I thought, was very ambitious. It talked about real fundamental changes in the politics of the region. It talked about... Yeah, go ahead, Shadi.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because my impression was almost the opposite. I thought it was a rather pedestrian speech, and disappointing in a number of ways. And the last thing I would call it is ambitious. So I think that's an interesting point of disagreement. And I guess we interpreted the speech in different ways. But there was nothing, America always says that it's on the side of democracy and reform. So, all the rhetoric was there, but that was nothing new. But what I found surprising was that there were no surprises in this speech. The White House spokesman, Jay Carney, had been talking about a sweeping, comprehensive speech that really brings all the different strands of U.S. policy together. And I didn't really see that. Where were the bold new initiatives? Where was the vision? And saying that you support democracy in the Middle East is not a vision. There was some criticism of Bahrain. That's nice. That was welcomed. And I think the Bahraini opposition appreciated that. But what are we going to do about Bahrain? So we have to figure out, how do we translate that rhetoric where we say we support democracy into actual policy changes on the ground? I was waiting to hear a roadmap. I was waiting to hear how that kind of comes together, and it wasn't there.
But I do think that, well, I agree with you that I think that the roadmap wasn't there. The policy instruments were all pretty old-fashioned and limited. I particularly thought that the emphasis on economic reform was misplaced because in the regimes that I think have the best chance of democratic development, Tunisia and Egypt, where we actually have seen autocrats overthrown, although the many elements of the old power structures are still important in both those countries. they're the two countries in the Middle East where economic reform has gone the furthest, at least economic reform on the model of the Washington Consensus, globalization, opening your markets, that kind of thing. It's profoundly unpopular, right? I mean, we saw that in the demonstrations against both Ben Ali and Mubarak. So I think if we have democratic politics in Tunisia and Egypt, I think that at least the initial economic thrust is going to be away from those kinds of market reforms, more toward the kind of statist, social safety net, more socialist policies of earlier years in both Tunisia and Egypt. So I'm not sure how the economic side of this is going to jive up with supporting democracy development in both of those countries. But I guess while I agree with you in terms of the means, I thought that there was an enormous ambition in the speech on the level of President Bush's speeches about the Middle East, talking about changing fundamental domestic political realities and inclinations, like we are going to work to assure that the role of women is equal to that of men, that universal rights are applied to women. We are going to work to secure religious tolerance and religious freedom throughout the region. We are going to work for the end of corruption in these regimes. I certainly have no quibble with the goals here, but they're incredibly ambitious. Aside from supporting the institutions, the institution of democratic systems, these are really ambitious. And in some of these countries, right, democratic systems will not lead to these other things that we want, like religious tolerance, possibly religious tolerance, or what we would consider to be equal rights for women.
Yeah, I agree with you that the goals are ambitious, but America's role as presented by the Obama administration was less so. I mean, I didn't really see, and this is where we get to the discussion about Obama's general foreign policy orientation. And in that big New Yorker article,
right,
there was this description of Obama leading from behind, and I think that's really an appropriate way of describing how the U.S. now sees itself in the broader community, that we're going to be humble, we're going to move back, we're going to let others lead, it's up to Arabs to make their own decisions, and of course it is. I mean, no one's disagreeing with that. But what I found to be a little bit disingenuous in a lot of this kind of talk is we aren't a neutral party. We aren't innocent bystanders here that are going to just kind of jump in altruistically. And what I had actually wanted to see Obama do is acknowledge America's really, quite frankly, tragic role in the region over the last 5 decades and say, listen, and address this to Arab audiences, we made serious mistakes. We supported autocratic regimes for 5 decades. We did not support your democratic aspirations. And you know what? We were wrong. And I actually had written an article for Slate the day before this speech where I called on Obama to actually issue an apology. And I knew, of course, that wasn't going to be realistic, but at the very least, an acknowledgement of that kind of role. Because if we don't understand where we've been, it's very hard to correct our past policies and come up with a new, bold, ambitious foreign policy, if that is in fact what we want to do. And I've been an advocate of the U.S. fundamentally realigning and reorienting its policy in the Middle East to be in line with Arab democratic aspirations. But I don't think we can do that until we really face our past and try to understand why is it that we supported these autocratic regimes in the first place, and why is it going to be different this time around?
Yeah, I'd have a very, very different take on that. I don't think any apologies are in order. I mean, I think we pursued a foreign policy that any other great power would have pursued. We had Cold War obligations there according to our definition of our national interest during the Cold War. We supported regimes that were friendly to us, that secured our material interests to some extent. I mean, we can argue to the extent that this policy actually secured our interests, but it was a classic great power foreign policy. And
it failed, and I think that's I think what we have to learn from the Arab Spring in the last 5.
I'm not sure. You say it failed. I mean, I think that that there were some successes along the way, including 2 Arab-Israeli peace treaties, which I think were important. Turning back Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which I think was important. Containing the Iranian Revolution and its spread, at least containing it to certain parts of the Middle East, which I thought was important.
But Greg, I agree with you that there were successes, and I'm not denying that over the course of these several decades, we won some and we lost some. But I think now that we have a chance to look back and take stock of everything that's happened in a kind of broader perspective, I think my argument would be is that this so-called stability paradigm has failed, in the sense that now the Middle East is falling apart. We see a civil war in Libya. We see the potential outbreak of a new one in Yemen. We see Saudi Arabia, our presumably close ally, leading the Arab counter-revolution. We see unprecedented levels of anti-Americanism, and it's really worth pointing out that even after these revolutions started, the U.S. still has an incredibly low favorability rating, and there was actually a Pew poll taken in Egypt after the Egyptian uprising succeeded, and Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden have higher favorability ratings than the U.S. after the revolution. I mean, you take that all together, and I don't really see how this Middle East that we've ended up with is good for our interests, and we're totally losing control.
Well, I don't think we ever had control, and I think that's one of the. I do think that that's one of the illusions that drives our policy and has driven it certainly for the last decade, that we have control over these events, and we don't. I think we're extremely bad at trying to direct events in the Middle East. You would like a more involved policy, I think. I would like a more hands-off policy. I would like to see.
Well, let's talk about your art. I mean, let's just kind of flag your article in the National Interest for our viewers. I would really recommend that everyone read it. And Greg outlined some of the major points earlier. But, I think this question of more intervention versus less intervention is a very relevant one. And I think that's the kind of broader strategic thinking that we have to be talking about. Mm-hmm. And I like how your article, tries to take a step back and think bigger. I worry sometimes that our foreign policy is very much about reacting to crises and not about, the broader vision. But, my basic argument would be, yes, you're right to point out that our interventions have caused a lot of problems in the region, that the more we get involved, the more we seem to mess things up. We have a very bad history of meddling, and I think the vast majority of Arabs would probably agree with that assessment of U.S. policy. But I think we have to distinguish between bad intervention and good intervention. I don't think intervention per se is the problem. Now, maybe you're less optimistic that America can ever shift from a bad intervention sort of policy to a good one, because that's a reasonable argument. But what I would like to see is, yes, we've messed up in the past, but that's why it's incumbent upon us to get it right this time and intervene in a way that supports not only our interests in the region, but the aspirations of Arabs themselves, so that at the end of the day, they can say, the U.S. is actually playing a more constructive role in the region. The U.S. is on the right side of history. The U.S. is supporting our political rights and freedoms, and I think there is a way to do that. And I think it's also a little bit unrealistic to think that we can ever take this full step back and have this non-interventionist approach, because we're so intertwined with this region, and the region is strategically vital to us and will be for the foreseeable future. So even even if it was advisable for us to take a step back, I'm not even sure how that would actually happen in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I recognize that what I said in this, and it really wasn't an article, it was just a blog post. So don't exaggerate it's intellectual weight. It was a blog post, but I think that it's extremely difficult for people in the policy community to imagine a less involved American role in the Middle East. Now, whether that involvement is more geostrategic or more democracy promotion, this notion that there has to be a big involvement in the Middle East, I think, is very ingrained in the policy community. And I think it's time to step back and say, is it necessary for us to be so involved in the Middle East, right? I mean, the drivers, oil, Arab-Israeli conflict, I'm not so sure that there's that much that we can do. That's in terms of interests. I mean, setting aside the democracy issue for a second. I don't think there's that much we can do on Arab-Israeli questions these days, given the situation on the ground, given the political realities. And oil, it just seems to me that these oil producers are going to produce oil. And our involvement in the politics of the region, it doesn't have to be as an intense and as militaristic to see oil keep on flowing. And so, but let me get back to the democracy thing, because I want to push you on this. You said you want.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, you said you think we should do good interventions, not bad interventions. Which, who can be against that? Everybody's against bad interventions, unless you still think the Iraq War was a good idea. So I just alienated 25% of the viewers. But is Libya a good intervention or a bad intervention?
Well, I would say good. And I actually think the success of the Libya operation has become more apparent as we've kind of come along the last 2 months. We prevented a massacre, and we talked about this in our previous Blogging Heads debate. But we prevented a massacre that could have taken the lives of thousands of people. And the Libyan rebels are now gaining ground. The momentum is shifting away from Gaddafi's forces. The rebels, in a very, I think, powerful victory, recaptured Misrata. So, I mean, all of this suggests that we're getting closer to an end game. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but sooner or later, assuming the NATO operation continues, Gaddafi is going to leave, and the regime in its current constitution is not going to be able to sustain itself. And if we get to that goal, I think that'll be remembered as a major victory, for the Arab Spring, for the Libyan people, and also for a more peaceful, stable Middle East. I think a Middle East without Gaddafi is a better one. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one example, I think, of a good intervention. And that's not to say that there have been problems and setbacks. It's a difficult debate, and we talked about this. I think, look...
Yeah, let me just... How do we measure success here? Is success going to be the removal of Gaddafi? Because right now, I don't see that happening in the short term, unless we get in a lucky punch and kill him. And I think that's what NATO's after right now. I think we're trying to kill him from the air. And I just, one hopes that it happens because we're involved now. But I really question whether we brought the means necessary to achieve the ends. And this gets to the larger point. You said at the beginning, and rightly so, I think, that you thought that the president's speech didn't lay out a roadmap to how to get to the very ambitious goals he laid out. But I wonder if that is imposed on the United States by our resource constraints. We are not the country that we were in 2003 when we invaded Iraq. We don't have the political will for major investments, whether military or, frankly, political and financial in the Middle East. We don't have the money. I mean, one of the reasons that the Ryan Lizza article talked about leading from behind is that we can't pay for it ourselves anymore. And it does seem to me that we have to match up means and ends. And I don't see that matchup of means and ends in our current disposition toward the Middle East. I think we have very ambitious ends, we have very limited means, and no matter how good the intentions of the policy are, I think that's a recipe for really bad results.
Precisely, and that's why what I'm advocating is keeping the ends as ambitious as possible, but matching our means.
Yeah.
So that would mean, and that's precisely, I guess, what you're warning against. But
I'm for scaling down the ends.
Yeah. But I don't want people to think that, I'm not advocating for the U.S. military to be playing the main role in supporting this change. I think we've learned that doesn't work, and I think that will remain one of the important lessons of the Bush era. I mean, when I talk about a more aggressive interventionist U.S. foreign policy, what I'm talking about is using our diplomatic toolbox, using our aid packages, and just kind of, thinking outside the box a little bit. So we do have strong bilateral relations with many of these regimes, whether it's Morocco, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. I mean, Jordan's the second largest per capita recipient of U.S. aid. We can use those aid packages as leverage. And, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, I don't think it's very revolutionary. I think it should be step one, is that if people want to continue receiving assistance from us, they should have to meet a series of benchmarks. Mm-hmm. Now, if they don't, we could maybe consider cutting aid. I actually prefer a more positive approach, positive conditionality, where we put a pot of money and we say, here it is, and we want to encourage you to meet these expectations, and if you do, there's additional assistance that's available to you.
Didn't we do that already under the Bush administration? Wasn't that the Millennium Challenge goals and the Greater Middle East Initiative? Didn't we already do that?
Millennium Challenge, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the MCC, is more about economic conditionality and poverty reduction. It's not really based around political reform, and of course, there's MEPI as well. Yeah.
Right, MEPI and the Greater Middle East Initiative was though based around political reform, right?
Right, but there wasn't a lot of money in that. I mean, we're talking about $100 million in MEPI. What I'm talking about is a pretty big pot of money, and I realize that there are resource constraints right now. But if Saudi Arabia is willing to give Bahrain, a country of only 500,000 people, $1 billion a year over 10 years. And we have to be willing to match that sort of approach and get serious about putting billions of dollars into some kind of reform endowment to show the Arab world that we are 100% serious about supporting democracy in the region.
I just think that would be money ill spent. I'm not sure that we would get what we wanted, and I'm not sure that I'm not sure. I think that there are better uses for that money. But let's switch off this because you mentioned Saudi Arabia, which might be the key country here, right? We have aid leverage on Morocco. We have aid leverage on Jordan. We don't have any aid leverage on Saudi Arabia. And if people see Saudi Arabia as the big counter-revolutionary force in the Middle East, and there's an article by Vali Nasser, our friend, on Bloomberg that makes this argument. We don't have that kind of aid leverage. And the Saudis don't need our money, that's for sure. So what's your take on the whole idea that Saudi Arabia is the big sticking point in moving ahead?
I really do agree with that. I think Saudi Arabia is the leader of the counter-revolution. And I think it's also worth pointing out how the Arab Spring has evolved, because when we started our first debate, I think that was in the fall before all this started, and then we had our most recent discussion in March when there was still this sense of euphoria and excitement. We were just coming off the Egyptian revolution. Right. I don't think there is an Arab Spring to speak of anymore, because what does spring suggest? Spring suggests flowers, blossoming, forward momentum. There is nothing of the sort now in the Middle East.
But if we go back to the original political usage of spring, right? It was the Prague Spring, which was snuffed out in 1968. So actually, this might be looking more like the Prague Spring than something else.
Right. Well, there definitely was an Arab Spring, but I'm just not sure if that's the best way to describe what's going on right now. Because, well, whether we look at Syria, Libya, Bahrain, we have regimes that have decided to wage war against their own people. And Bahrain is shocking. Let's not even talk about that. I mean, that's just like, and they're a close U.S. ally.
No, and I'd actually be happy to talk about Bahrain because I think that I actually think you and I might be closer on the policy side on Bahrain.
Oh, great!
Coming at it from different sides, but
let's go back to Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So what explains this fact that the momentum has shifted and that regimes are more emboldened? They're using force against their own people. They're really just killing their own people in many instances. And Saudi Arabia is very much supporting that, whether tacitly or directly. I mean, directly in Bahrain, where they actually are more or less, occupying the country in some way. When they sent in
forces.
About 1,500 troops in March. So Saudi Arabia has made very clear and very publicly clear that it doesn't like that the U.S. facilitated Hosni Mubarak's departure in Egypt. They want him to stay in power. And they don't trust the Obama administration. We're sort of in this odd position now where Arab reformers don't believe we're serious about democracy, and our Arab autocratic allies think we're too serious about democracy. So no one really is comfortable with our approach right now, which is a really troubling position to be in. And I think that's oftentimes what ends up happening with Obama's policies. He tries to please everyone, but ends up disappointing everyone instead. So, Saudi Arabia is a tough one because they're willing to put their money where their mouths are, and they're putting in billions and billions of dollars to shore up vulnerable regimes in Bahrain, Oman. They've recently invited Jordan and Morocco to join the Gulf Cooperation Council, even though Morocco and Jordan are not part of the Gulf geographically. So, go figure there. But what they're trying to do there is create this club of monarchies and to have a kind of security alliance in some ways similar to the Baghdad Pact of the Cold War era, where countries share a basic set of security interests. They want to stay in power. They want to support each other. And that's very different than what the GCC was originally meant to do. It was supposed to be about economic integration. There was talk about a currency union.
Please, Shadi, don't buy that hype. The GCC was always about regime security. Always.
Sure, but
it had some ancillary economic elements to it. But the most important thing about the GCC was that the interior ministers got together and talked regularly.
Yeah, but there was an important economic component.
There was talk of an economic component. These are not compatible economies. Come on. I mean, they all export the same thing. They all look. We don't have to get into the details of the GCC, which fascinate you and me, but probably wouldn't be that exciting to bloggingheads.tv.
Yeah, sure.
But let me go. Let me give you a slightly different take on the Saudis. The Saudis are the power of Saudi Arabia dissipates the further away you get from the country, its borders. And thus, I think it's a bit, its role in Bahrain is obvious and clear and extremely negative. I agree with you 100% there. Once you start getting further away, it's not as clear to me that the Saudis can play this kind of blocking role. When you look at Syria, I don't think that the Saudis had much to do with the beginning of the revolts in Syria, nor do I think they have much to do with the way the Assad regime has handled them. If you look in Yemen, the Saudis were trying to ease Ali Abdullah Saleh out of power. Now, I don't think that they want to encourage democracy in Yemen, but I think you'd probably agree with me that a democratic outcome in Yemen is not highly likely in the short term.
Right.
It seems to me that once you get into North Africa, the influence of Saudi Arabia is highly dissipated. Sure, they've got money, but money don't buy you love. And you can't buy people; you can only rent them. When I look at the Moroccans who say, "Sure, we'll join the GCC," I think that they just that what they're basically saying, "Sure, we'll take your money," and of course they will. But will that direct politics in Morocco? I think that the Saudis have an enormous influence in Bahrain. And we'll get to Bahrain in a second because I think it's really important and underappreciated here in the United States. But it seems to me that we're puffing the Saudis up more than they deserve to say that they can, lead the counter-revolution against democratic movements in the Middle East. Egypt and Tunisia are going to have problems, as we would both recognize, as they go forward. But I don't think that their problems can be blamed on Saudi Arabia. The Saudis aren't going to help the Egyptians become democratic. And the Saudis are holding out money to the Egyptians. Interestingly enough, after all this talk about how the Saudis are appalled with what happened in Mubarak and they're so mad at us, they just committed $4 billion to the Egyptian government.
That comes with strings attached.
Well, we'll see. We'll see if the Egyptians have the guts to take the money and then tell the Saudis to shove off, which they might.
But that's precisely what I'm worried about here. I mean, Saudi Arabia is trying to use. And Morocco, I think, is a similar case here. Let's say Morocco accepts Saudi money. Mm-hmm. The Saudis are expecting something in return. I mean, that's the way these things work. And I think what we're seeing here is really a bid by the Saudis to expand their influence in new places and to become more of a regional power. So I think, yes, up until now, Saudi Arabia's influence has been largely in the Gulf and in the closer areas and not really when you go further afield. But I think we have to anticipate that if the Saudis continue on their current course, they can become increasingly influential, especially if our influence as the U.S. continues to decrease. Mm-hmm. Because someone's got to fill the vacuum. So it could be Saudi Arabia, it could be countries that like Saudi Arabia, like China and Russia, that sort of sympathize with Saudi Arabia's kind of government, in other words, an autocracy. So, I think there's a bigger concern here about the implications of America's decline in the Middle East and what's going to take its place.
Yeah, I guess I just think that the course of domestic politics in these countries is going to be much more driven by their own domestic internal dynamics. Outsiders, whether it's us, the Saudis. I don't think the Chinese want to get involved at all in this kind of stuff. I think that the outside influence, unless you go in whole hog and send in troops like we did in Iraq or like the Saudis did in Bahrain, I think that unless that happens, your influence is at the margins. And if you're at a tipping point in things, maybe you as an outside power can really affect it. But it seems to me that the Saudis giving money to the Egyptians or us giving money to the Egyptians is going to have at most a marginal and canceling out effect on the future of Egyptian politics, which is going to be determined by internal dynamics, some of which we have no idea about, frankly. So I think that it's too easy to say, oh, the Saudis, they're going to, we have to stand against them. They're going to block the democratic development. I think that you got to take it case by case. We could work with the Saudis in Yemen, and we were. And they are without a doubt the most influential country in Yemen. And having them, on our side would help us to get a better result in Yemen. Do we want them involved in Bahrain? No. But there they are. So I'll speak to Bahrain in a second. In Egypt, the Egyptian government needs money. Lord knows. And we can't give them everything they need. So if they can get money from the Saudis to help them get through this very, very rough patch they're going through, I can't blame them. Now, if the Saudis put strings on that, they'll want to. I think it's up to the Egyptians, once they have their elections, to basically say, those strings, we're not interested in being pulled by those strings. If you want to keep helping us because you think our stability and our security are important, and you don't want to lose influence as we develop a larger regional role, we're very happy to continue the relationship. But that's up to the Egyptians to tell the Saudis what the limits are. Let me just say one more thing about Bahrain, and then we'll go with that, because I do think that we're probably pretty close on Bahrain, although starting from different points. I think that it is absolutely useless for the United States to have unstable allies, to have allies, to have military bases in countries that are unstable, where we will get sucked in to internal fights because the government can't maintain order, can't maintain a decent political system. And that is my fear in Bahrain. We have the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet there. I always say that you can't swing a dead cat in Manama without hitting 3 or 4 American sailors or Marines. Out on R&R, out going to restaurants, guys with highs and tights. They're everywhere in Manama. And I think that the actions of the Bahraini government, while in the short term driving their opposition back into their houses, has the distinct chance down the road of fomenting a more violent opposition toward the Al Khalifa government. And we, I think, could get sucked into that. It could put at risk the security of our forces. It could put at risk the security of Fifth Fleet headquarters. And I think it's time to start thinking about relocation.
Oh, I think on that we do agree. We definitely do agree. Why does the Fifth Fleet have to be in Bahrain? And I think
it doesn't.
This is also I think a point of leverage that we have with the Bahrainis.
Right. Yeah, and we should be using it right now.
Yeah, and we should have a very frank talk with them and say, if this continues, as you've said, over the long term, where the opposition continues to be suppressed, and then you see more radicalization, where the opposition moves towards, more pro-Iran sympathies and so on and so forth, that's not good for anyone. It's not good for our interests. It's not good for the Bahraini people, and it's unsustainable. So, but that's where I think we get to this issue of how much leverage does the U.S. really have? And I've been accused of overestimating U.S. leverage. I tend to think that international factors are quite important in facilitating political change in the Arab world. I think U.S. policymakers, for a number of reasons, pretend that they act as if the U.S. isn't a superpower. Oh, we can't do a lot. It's not up to us. We can just kind of help on the margins. I mean, we are.
That's me.
Well, it's hard to know how much leverage we have if we never try to use it. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we have to test and practice, and only then can we find out for sure. But I think if we sat down with the Bahrainis and put the Fifth Fleet on the table and really got serious with them, they may be pushed to reconsider. At the end of the day, the Gulf regimes are benefiting from a U.S. security umbrella. They feel threatened by Iran, and we sell them arms, we train their armies. They are very much dependent on us militarily. If we withdrew from the Gulf and said, you guys fend for yourselves, they can't run their own armies. They can't fly their own planes. They need our help and assistance and advice to be able to do that effectively. And for that reason, I've always said, the Saudis need us more than we need them. The Bahrainis need us more than we need them. Why don't we test that proposition?
Well, I think you're absolutely right with the smaller states. And Bahrain is the one place I think that we could have, in all the Arab world, I think we could have the most immediate positive effect if what you want to do is encourage political reform, or in my case, if you want to de-link the United States from potentially unstable allies. Bahrain is the place where we could have the most effect. I think it's where we have the most leverage. I think we have more leverage there than in Libya, even though we're using military force in Libya. I think we have more leverage in Bahrain. I'm not so sure that we have that same kind of leverage with Saudi Arabia. And I'm not so sure that our interests in Saudi Arabia are the same as they are in Bahrain. It's one thing to talk about a country where masses of the people, and in Bahrain, it's masses of the people took to the streets, demanding political change and political reform. In Saudi Arabia, for a whole set of reasons, you don't have that kind of popular upheaval. Now, the argument might be that, well, you're going to get it eventually, so we should push them real hard now. I think I just think that it would be really hard to do that, because to tell the Saudis, look, you've got to change your domestic political system, or we're not going to defend you. See, I don't think is a credible threat, because we don't defend the Saudis because we like them, right? We defend the Saudis because we think we have an interest in preventing any single power besides ourselves from becoming dominant in the world's oil patch, and
Right.
so they could run a little bluff on us. Bahrain, we have the leverage of the base, which is not just a protection for the Bahrainis. It's an economic asset for the Bahrainis, and it's incredibly symbolic for the Al Khalifa regime. So we have leverage there that can be used immediately. I'm not so sure in Saudi if we have that same kind of leverage.
Well, why not explore it further?
Well, because I'm not a democracy promoter, and so I don't care if the Saudis democratize. But
I'm not saying that we should put pressure on the Saudis to democratize. I actually don't think that should be terribly high on our priority list, because Saudis themselves have not come out in large numbers. I agree with you that in countries where hundreds of thousands of people have made clear their desire for change, we should support that. Hasn't happened in Saudi yet.
Yeah.
Okay, but I think pressuring the Saudis to play a more constructive role in the region, to stop intervening so aggressively in countries like Bahrain, to stop trying to interfere really on what is American territory when we're talking about trying to peel off Morocco and Jordan from the U.S. orbit. That's kind of a little bit of an aggressive move, and I think we should make clear to the Saudis they're our friends more than they're your friends, and we have big aid packages with them, and we don't want you to be stepping on our feet like this. So, I'm just worried about the Saudis' regional role more than what's happening there internally.
I'll tell you what I worry about. It's not so much Morocco and Jordan. I actually think that the Saudis' money will buy them some influence. Our money will buy us some influence. The Moroccan and Jordanian regimes will balance. It'll be an interesting show. To me, the more dangerous thing about how the Saudis are reacting, aside from Bahrain, which I thought was very bad, is the increased salience of sectarianism. It doesn't make that much difference in North Africa, but in the Gulf and in the Mashriq, in the Arab East, where you have substantial sectarian divisions in a lot of countries, Sunni Shia is what I'm talking about here. The Saudis seem to be trying to escalate the sectarian salience here. The Iranians always tried to downplay sectarianism because the Shia are a minority throughout the Muslim world. They want to break out of that sectarian box, say we're all Muslims, and we have as much right in Iran to provide a model as the Sunnis do. The Saudis, I think, are now playing the sectarian card in a big way.
Right. That's for sure.
Yeah, and it makes politics in Iraq, politics in Bahrain, politics in Kuwait, politics in Lebanon, politics in Syria so much more dangerous. If I'm pushing the Saudis on anything, it would be the sectarianism. Not so much the money they're giving to Egypt. I think that the Egyptians are skillful enough that if they want democratic reform, they'll take the Saudis' money and still do what they want. I worry more about the increased sectarianism, particularly in Iraq, but also in these other places that I mentioned, that could be a fertile ground for the revival of Salafi jihadism.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
And we're seeing the rise of Salafis in Egypt right now.
Right.
And that's one indirect method that the Saudis have to influence politics there.
Yeah, I don't know. Go ahead. I don't know.
I'm not saying the Saudi regime is directly financing Salafi groups in any kind of systematic way.
Right. We don't have any evidence on that. Yeah.
It's certainly the case, though, that Saudi individuals with ties to the Saudi regime do support Salafi groups in Egypt. And there is definitely a sense that the Saudis have some leverage, but also through their clerics. I mean, many of the Salafi groups in Egypt look to some of the big Saudi scholars for inspiration and religious guidance. So there are different kind of ties and connections here. And I think that's one of the stories that I think we're only really starting to understand fully right now. I remember a couple of years back, whenever I would meet with Muslim Brotherhood leaders, they would tell me, Shadi, we're not worried about the liberals. We're not worried about leftists. We're worried about Salafis on our right.
For good reason, they're not worried about liberals. They're not a big threat to the Muslim Brothers in terms of popular support.
Exactly. The Salafis do have a lot of grassroots support. Yeah. They have popularity. So I wouldn't underestimate them.
No, I don't either. And I think that the story of the growth of the Salafi movement is a fascinating one. The thing that I find sad about all this, this rise of sectarianism as a result of events of the last months, and as a result of Saudi policy here, is that we had seen one element of the Salafi movement, which is of most concern to us in the United States, Salafi jihadism, really on the decline. And the killing of bin Laden, I think, is just the punctuation point on this. Right. The Salafi jihadists, and I don't want to say all Salafis are jihadists, they're not. But the Salafi jihadists had gone from a big victory in 9/11 and a number of victories before to defeat, it seems to me. Defeat in Iraq, defeat in Saudi itself, the inability to create any state that they had a major role in, the loss of their base in Afghanistan. They were really on the downslide. And my fear is that an intensification of sectarianism will allow them to regroup. And that, I think, could be very dangerous. Yeah,
that's definitely something we have to watch very, very closely. Yeah. No doubt. I mean, Greg, I think we're in our last 5 to 10 minutes here. I just wanted to go back to this issue of international factors as we close up here and kind of explain some of my thinking a little bit more. I think we've been talking about different, a consensus in Washington and things like that. I think another consensus in Washington, and we hear this a lot, especially from Obama administration officials, is, this isn't about us, this is about them. Right. And that international factors here aren't as crucial. And after all, people weren't protesting primarily against the U.S. or Israel. They were protesting against their own domestic governments and so on. But at the same time, I think what we've started to realize here is that there's about, let's say there's 20 Arab countries, depending on, the definition of an Arab country. There's only been 2 successful revolutions. There's 18 to go.
Yeah, we don't even know if those 2 are successful yet.
Exactly right. So I think this actually reinforces the point that sometimes the domestic factors are not enough. Sometimes populations getting angry and protesting on the streets is not enough to see a real change in regime. And that has been further reinforced in Bahrain because, just to say one more thing about Bahrain, we saw incredibly large protests where more than 100,000 people were protesting in a country of perhaps 600,000 citizens.
A huge percentage.
That is a remarkable percentage.
A huge percentage of the population.
But the fact that you had that kind of mobilization, but you didn't see any real structural political change, I think shows you that sometimes you need to have the domestic factors align with the international factors. And that's what wasn't present in Bahrain. So I think there is really an argument to be made here that what the U.S. does really can matter. But not just the U.S., but other international players, the U.S., the EU, Saudi Arabia, the World Bank, the IMF, the G8, Russia and China if they want to get more involved down the road. I think this is actually, an area that is very much affected and shaped by regional and international forces. And so, one of the reasons I really would like to see the U.S. play a more bold and ambitious role, I think we have an opportunity here. I don't want to put it, this might not be the best way to put it, but, to use the Arab Spring or to take advantage of the amazing opportunity we have in the Arab world today to reassert the good side of American leadership. That we've been on the decline, supposedly, for the last 5 years or 10 years or God knows how long. This is a chance for us to say, we still matter. This is how we matter. At the end of the day, when people are fighting for their freedom, they're not looking to Russia and China and Saudi Arabia for support. They turn to the U.S. They turn to Europe because there is still a sense that the U.S. can be better, that we want to be better. And you feel that. I mean, Obama probably does want to do the right thing deep down somewhere, So I think there's a real opportunity here. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I just take it from a very different analytical stance. I look at the upheavals in Tunisia and Egypt, and I say, wow, this was completely generated from within these countries because all the international factors, frankly, were against them. And yet these people were able to mobilize on the street and begin a process of change, get rid of autocrats, and maybe institute more democratic governments. Good on them, right? Good on them. They're doing it themselves. I think the United States should do nothing to hinder that. How much we can help, I don't know. And I think we have to be realistic in the sense that while it might feel good for us to see Arabs say, wow, American democracy, that's the model, not Saudi Arabia, not China. Once you get democracy in these countries, their foreign policies are going to be are not going to always accord with the United States, and on some important issues will be much more difficult for us to deal with. And I think we just have to recognize that. I don't think that that's a reason to work against any of this. I mean, as I said, I'll quote John Quincy Adams on this. I think we should be the friend of liberty everywhere, but the champion only of our own. And if the Egyptians achieve liberty and they have a foreign policy that is less cooperative with us on military matters, that is less cooperative with us on Arab-Israeli questions, fine. We can live with that. But I do not think that the international role, let me put it this way. I don't think that the United States has the means to play a major role in directing domestic politics of these Arab states. And I think if we try, we will probably mess it up. So to me, that's an argument to stand back. Standing back means that sometimes the people will lose, right? Sometimes the good guys will lose. But I fear that that's the tragedy of international relations, that we don't always get good results. So, yeah, I think that we're back to our original point, Shadi. we haven't convinced each other to change our opinions. Maybe in our next meeting, I should argue your point of view, and you should argue my point of view. And who knows? Maybe by the next time we talk, we'll have some more results. Maybe we'll see something different in Yemen. Maybe we'll see something different in Libya. Maybe we'll see something different in Syria. Maybe we'll see the deliverables from the Obama speech. Maybe we don't. Maybe they've got more up their sleeves than we know. And so
I wouldn't hold my breath on that. I wouldn't.
Right. Well, always good talking to you, Shadi. Enjoy the summer.
It was great.
Enjoy the summer in Doha, if that is possible.
It's getting hot.
Right. And we'll talk again. And thanks to everybody for watching.
Okay, Greg. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.